and it's just not happening. And so we're going to focus on Sarah, and my intent in the first part of the message is to kind of be her advocate and say, this is really a big deal. This is really a discouraging situation. This is huge as years march on and God's not coming through. So let's start off with the first point we pick up about Sarah, and that is she is marrying Abram at the time. And just to put it in a geographical sense, let's do our New England states right here. She is marrying Abram in Maine. God is promising her husband that he's going to inherit Massachusetts. But for a while, they have to go down to Connecticut before they come back. So as they are in Maine and she is married to her husband, she gets married, and we don't have so much the ages of Sarah through these different transitions, but we have the ages of Abram through these transitions. But at one point, we get their age at the same time, and that's when the birth of Isaac happens. When the birth of Isaac happens, Abram is 100, and Sarah is, anybody know? 90. So Sarah is 10 years younger than Abram. So when they get married and God speaks to Abraham that he is to leave and go into this land that he has promised, Abram is 75. That means Sarah is 65. Okay? Now, ages were a little bit different. All right? Our story picks up with Sarah at 65 trying to have children. Now, we know at some point she gets past the childbearing age. It may already have happened if it was a modern day woman, but she's going to live to be the age of 127. So at 65, she may still have been childbearing eligible, or maybe not. We definitely know by the age of 90, she is not childbearing able, for the time of women has passed from her. So I want you to just kind of walk through these phases. At 65, she may or may not be able to have children, but they're leaving to head to a promised land where they're going to have hundreds, heirs that will be like the stars. So at 65, they leave. I'm going to assume that they were trying before the age of 65 to have children. And month after month, the news comes back, we are not pregnant. At the age of 65, she's older. In modern day, she probably would not be able to have children, but in her age, she's still foxy enough that when they go through Massachusetts, Abram says, if we meet the king, please tell him you're my sister. Otherwise, he'll kill me and steal you from me. So at 65, in her age, she was still quite attractive and considered primary choices for female partnership in a marriage. When they get down to Connecticut, he again says, when we meet the king of Connecticut, tell him you're my sister. All right, so I'm studying this and I'm working that. Now you guys, you read your Bible, right? So you knew all this, right? So you got this all figured out. So at 65, they're leaving Maine. They're headed towards Massachusetts. She is probably still childbearing able, but by the time she reaches 75, 10 years from when this story picks up, she is at a frustration point. Now, here's what I don't know. I know at 65 she was probably childbearing. I know at 90 she's not childbearing. The Bible doesn't say her condition at 75. So let me play it out both ways. At 75, we assume she's not childbearing age because of our context and because the Bible later on says she's not able to bear children, but it doesn't say it at 75. So let's say at 75, she is still able to bear children. But it's been at least 10 years, we know, that she's been trying. And at 75, if she can still, she must know that the end of that stage of fertility is approaching. And after 10 years of trying, plus whatever they tried before that, you got to be wondering, when is God going to do this? How is God going to do this? God is missing a lot of great opportunities to answer this prayer. We're going to be too old to have children. Right? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Oh, we got one at 60.
At 60, they didn't go. Right? So they're going through this phase. Let's assume, first scenario, at 75, she is still menstruating. She can still have children. And she's just tired of waiting on God. So she steps up. The other possible scenario is maybe I'm not the one that's infertile. Abram hadn't had any offspring from any other wives or previous wives or concubine, any of the things that's going on. He says to God in our text, I have no offspring. Abram has no offspring. Sarah has no offspring. Who would be able to determine who's at fault at this point at 75? But then she comes up with a suggestion. God needs some help. God's forgotten about us. God doesn't understand what we're going through. So how about this? I have a maid, she lives with us, she's younger, she is probably likely to have children. So why don't you marry her and see if God will grant the two of you children? Abraham, for some reason, goes along with that plan. Okay. I don't understand that. Joy did that to me. We would never have an Ishmael running around anyway. No. All right? One's enough. All right, no. All right? The plan was one man, one woman for life. And so she comes up with this plan to help God out. And in that plan, she now realizes that it's not Abram that's infertile. It is her. She is the one that has prevented this promise from coming true. And while you think she would be happy that she had found out the error or the problem and circumvented it, once she sees Hagar's son running around, she despises it. I made a mistake. This is not right. I don't like this. I shouldn't have helped God out. And then along comes age 90. Now, whether she was in menopause at 75, she clearly is. The Bible states so at 90. Whatever was going on at 75, it is now clearly amplified by the fact that she has stopped menstruating. And I know you did not come to church to plan to hear a biological lesson. Menstruate. So, give me 2 minutes. A woman is created with only so many eggs. And at a certain phase, as she enters into adolescence, the body begins to release one of those eggs a month. The body, in anticipation of conception happening, changes the lining of the uterus, stores up blood for the nourishment of a second body. And the body itself, no matter what the woman's mind is saying, I'm ready for children, I don't want children, no matter what the mind says, the body is preparing itself for the opportunity of creating life. And when that period passes and that egg is not fertilized, then the body says, not this month. And it discharges the eggs, discharges the nourishment, and then it waits until next month. At some point, those eggs run out, and there is no egg that is dropped that month, and the body stops preparing for the possibility of the creation of life. When it happens, it doesn't happen immediately in a single month. A month may get skipped, no egg is dropped, and then a month or two later, an egg may be dropped. And so there's this transition phase, but Sarah has gone through that. She has gone through the periods of fertility, and then that first month when an egg doesn't drop, she, oh, God, how long are you going to wait? And so she has gone through not only trying to conceive during times of fertility, she has gone through years of that waiting month after month to hear the news. And she has now gone through the transition of life to where she's not even capable to conceive and have a child. And in her frustration, she has come up with this plan that she now regrets. With that basis, let's tune in to Sue's testimony and see what God did in her life.
Thank you, Lord. Even as I share today, I just pray that your name would be glorified. As I share my story, that someone would receive victory in this place today of what you have done and what you can do for them. In Jesus' name. Well, like Sarah, I was tired of waiting for God's promise. That was so powerful, Dr. Wootton. Thank you. I had waited. At 7 years old, I was saved. I'd given my heart to Jesus at 7. Felt called to be a pastor's wife at 12. Led people in my public school to Jesus that are walking with the Lord today. Went to Bible school at 18. Ministered to many people there. From age 20 to 40, I worked at a residential program for women with life-controlling addictions. Started an inner-city church, reached out to people in the community. And in that time, even in the ups and downs of ministry, I loved the Lord with all my heart. I loved him, but there was always in the back of my mind, where is my husband? Where are my children? Right? So between 40 to 44, I began to get really bitter. And you know, it's really interesting because as I shared my story in churches and different places, I realized that I didn't see that, of course, when it was happening. We don't see it when it's happening. We start spending less time with Jesus. We start pulling away from the things of God because we just want to kind of be in this place of, bitterness. So I started spending less time with the Lord, and I felt somehow, Lord, you owe me. You owe me a husband and children. I have served you my whole life. I have given everything. And of course I didn't start out that way, but I became a martyr, like I've done everything for you and you owe me these things. And we know, of course, that's the wrong mindset because God owes us nothing. He's given us everything. But I didn't want to be in one more wedding. I was the person that was always in every wedding. No more weddings. I didn't want to be at one more baby shower. Even though I felt at a young age that I would mother someone else's children as if they were mine and never carry a child. I really believed that as a young person. But there was the hope of the family, the whole package. So people at church, I would, in that ministry, or in that church, I had an office in that church that we had started at Inner City Church. And people would come into my office and they would say, oh, it is so wonderful that you have chosen to be in ministry and you have, instead of having a family. And I thought, why can't I have both? Why can't I have both? So we need to be, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So like a corridor of doors in my heart, I felt like the Lord was able to walk freely into all the different rooms of my heart. all these rooms, like you could come into this room and you could look at every part, and I had nothing to hide to God. I wanted him to see everything. But there was one room at the end of the hall that had a big sign on it that said, husband and children, do not enter. That's mine. You owe me. It's not even a prayer. It's like, I'm gonna have it. You promised me these things, I'm gonna get these things. So I'll never forget, thinking about the fact that God owed me in that place, but how, it's really interesting. We need to be careful for the places that we don't allow him into our heart. It's that very thing that almost destroyed my life. It was that very place that I said, it's not yours, it's mine. That he said, do you care? Are you okay with the way that I'm running your life? Are you okay with what I'm doing? I have a bigger purpose and plan that you don't even know. And are you okay with that? So the counterfeit sometimes looks like the promise when bitterness and disappointment start to set in. I'm going to say that again. The counterfeit, right? We know there's a counterfeit, like counterfeit money. There's always the thing that God has, and then there's the counterfeit that looks so good, but it's not the real thing. So the counterfeit looks like the promise when bitterness and disappointment set in. Again, I didn't even know this was happening to me in those 4 years. So what was my counterfeit? In 2012, while living in New Hampshire, I met a man from Texas. I was in ministry at the time. I met a man in Texas on eHarmony. And if anyone's ever been on a site, you know that you have to share like everything, what you had for breakfast that morning. You share everything, and I'm so open anyway. So everything is out there. It's very easy for someone to know exactly where you're at in a very short time on something like that. So several things that I saw. First, it was this man that I thought I waited for all these years, kind of like Eliab when he came into the room with David and said, surely this must be the one. He had 2 beautiful children that looked just like me, 7 and 9 years old. He was in the process, supposedly, of getting his credentials to be a pastor, as that was always my heart. He lived in the South, which of course I went to Bible school in the South, and that was my heart. I loved it down there. Everything had to be quick at the beginning. And of course, when someone or something is a counterfeit in your life, things have to move quick. They have to move so quick that you don't see what's really happening. Like that the wool can be pulled over your eyes. So before ever leaving, and I have to say this, before ever even leaving for Texas, he had already begun to control me via phone. He already had begun to control my ways of thinking. He had no clue, again, after seeing this from a distance. So I ended up marrying this man, a retired police officer, military, and martial art expert. In just 2 months, everything I'm going to share with you has happened in my life in 2 months. Very short-lived marriage, short-lived everything. There are many points that I can't touch on because my story, I've shared sometimes an hour this story because there's so much to it. But I want you to know that this man was a monster, but he had a monster. His dad was arrested shortly after everything happened with us for child molestation. He was a pastor. His dad had been a pastor. So he's still, I believe, serving for child molestation. So bad things happen to people, but God still loves those people. And even as I share this story, the Lord loves this man that did these things to me. And he still has a plan for him, and I pray one day he's freed. So these are the things that happened to me. And I feel like every time I share my story, I share different, and it's always who needs to be in this room. So I don't know who needs to hear these specific details. Some of them are not easy to share or not so easy to hear, I guess. I'm used to sharing my story. But I feel like there's specifics today that God wants to free some people from maybe some stories you've had. Sometimes we don't want to look back, but we have to go back before we can go forward. We have to look at the garbage that we found ourselves in before God can bring us through. So just a few things. This man would put me in the closet in these 2 months, and he would have me confess the things that I did, the horrible things to God that, of course, I did too. While his children prayed for forgiveness for the lustful ways that I had. This was a common thing that was happening. And authorities in Massachusetts that, of course, I've got help in the years past, have told me they believed he was special services as he served our country. But he would keep me sleep deprived and interrogate me often. My phone was taken early on, and I could only speak to my parents on speakerphone as if everything was so wonderful. I had to lie about everything. They could hear, like they know, I need lots of sleep. If anyone knows me, I need lots of sleep anyway. But I mean, I never could sleep. That was part of this abuse. So my parents kept saying, everything okay? And we'd be like, everything's wonderful. We went swimming today. We went here today. I mean, I wasn't doing any of that. I was just being held in this house. Friends like Ginny, like Ruthie, and people like my parents that were in the background saying, this isn't Sue, what in the world? I was so faithful, I had been in ministry my whole life. It was so opposite. I ministered to women for 20 years, coming out of situations like this, never saw the signs, how easily I could be deceived because I wanted this thing so bad that God owed me a husband and children. And so friends were calling and they were hysterical and like, what in the world? And my parents would give me their phone numbers. I'd be like, I'm gonna call them, but we're so busy doing fun things. I'll get back to them. No one had a clue what I was going through. He would drive me locally every day. He would drive me to a McDonald's. And he would decide with what he called God's assistance if I deserved a coffee, if I was worthy to get a coffee that day. So he would have me hold my head down in the car because he was concerned I would be lusting after the male or female associate that was at the window. And he would, again, shame me, and I would go home sometimes without that coffee, but I didn't deserve it. And you know, if you've heard of anyone, you know, you're brainwashed at this point, basically. I didn't know who I was at this point. He would drill me for information daily. So he would interrogate me daily. And part of the interrogation was, okay, I just put on my shirt, say it after me. And I'd have to tell him, you put on your shirt. I put on my belt, and it was all a way of breaking me down. And if I didn't say, repeat, I would, get hit. And it was just this, this is what's happening, this is what I'm doing. I'd go to the gas pump, and again, so tired. Again, if you know me, when I'm tired, I can't think straight. But literally, like at the gas pump, I had to tell him how many gallons meant this, and I was never great in math. I mean, I wasn't a great mathematician ever. So I had to like download that information or just get hit in the car, and just craziness. And again, I'm not the victim. God has used all this for good. So I want to, as much as I don't want everybody leaving here feeling like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. It was horrible, but God's used this for good. I want to keep mentioning that as I go. Excuse me. Because he had been a police officer, he knew how to strangle me without strangling me. So he would hold me against the wall and break all the blood vessels through my face, because he knew as a cop he would be, he could be arrested for, if he had blocked my throat, my air passage. So all these blood vessels were broken in my face, and when we sing that song, The Breath That I Breathe, I just weep. Because when I ever came to North Point years later and heard that song for the first time, I have breath today because of God. What the enemy meant for evil, oh, God has turned for good. God has turned for good. Even he was part of a church that was very deceived. I went one time to this church where they ushered us to the front of this huge church. They saw him as such a man of God. I mean, no one knew who this man was. And that was my last time at that church, as he was convinced I was lusting after every person that I looked at in the service. Just a sick situation. So I tried to run 25 times in that 2 months from that home. And he would break off the sandals or whatever I had on my feet, and he carried me back home. It was always in the middle of the night when I had no fear of what was outside that door because of what I was living inside that door. So I would literally run, and yeah, it was always 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and it was a time where nobody was really around to see what was happening. And he was the police, so I couldn't go to the police. Excuse me. So I do want to share this piece, and I felt like I just needed to share this, that while I was going through these things, the horrific things that I was facing, there was a presence of God in that room that I can't even begin to tell you. Being saved at 7, I felt like I never knew the Lord until I was 44 years old going through what I went through. It was like I would be speaking in tongues and in the spirit while he was hurting me, and I felt God's presence fill that room. I felt a peace that I knew this man could kill me, but he couldn't kill my soul. And there was a sense that I know God in such a way. I knew him before, but I know him today because in that darkness, he was there. In that place where I didn't get it, he got it. And he's used this for good. I share my story in so many places, and God has used this for his glory, for his honor. So on the morning of Sunday, October 14th, I believe it was October 14th, 2012, I ran for the last time. It was a Sunday morning. I was on the border of Oklahoma and Texas on a main highway. And I lose my place there. Yeah, and like I had said earlier, at this point, I didn't know who I was, but I knew I would never see my family again. One thing he would tell me daily is you were never going to see your parents again. And anyone that knows my parents, knows how much I love them and how they've been there for me through so many things. But God is so good, because in the midst of that, I was able to get my purse. He would always lock it in the car. So that day, miraculously, he had actually that morning told me he had packed everything I had. He used to keep it all in a room, and he would count every item every day to see if I had tried to take anything out of that room. So I had never been able to put my stuff in the closets or anything, but I knew where all that stuff was. Well, that morning he took it all to the garage, and he had one of these, I don't know what it's called, but the garage is attached to it. So he put all my stuff in the garage, and he said, I'm gonna throw everything out, and I'm gonna leave you. You can't get dressed or anything. I want you to just go out like this. And if you wanna leave me, this is your opportunity. But if you don't, things are gonna change. So I felt like that day, I really felt for my life. I didn't think it was an opportunity. So I told him that day, I'll do whatever. And that day I knew this is my last day. I've got to run. I've got to make this work. So that day I had to do several things. And then after that, I remember heading down the road, just trying to run. It was like 5 o'clock in the evening. And he was in the shower. I had my purse. I needed my license to get out of Texas. Lord, this is an opportunity. You need to be with me again. I thought I had done all these horrible things that I had thought in my head. So I was running down the street when he caught up with me in front of a Dunkin' Donuts and began to wrestle me at the store. And people just got in their car. To me, I get involved all the time now. People were just getting in their car, and they were like, oh my goodness. And nobody wanted to help. I was screaming. I had thrown my wedding bands and everything on the ground, and I was screaming, and and he was just trying to pull me back to the house. And somehow I got free, got across the highway to a CVS where he got his car with the little girl. He had already had the other little girl institutionalized because she wanted to see her mom. Whole nother story for another time. So I knew that I only had a window of time before he had to be at this hospital an hour from there to show face at this hospital with this little girl. So when I got in there, he stood at the desk, and the only number, of course, I had in my head was my parents' phone number. And thank God they were home. It was a Sunday afternoon, and then he picked up. I said, I've made a real mess of my life. I need help. I don't know, I believed it was all my fault at this point. And they said, whatever we can do. And I said, Esperanza, my friend Esperanza, that had just moved to Texas from New York just a month before I moved there, had been trying to reach them with everyone else, saying, what in the world, we're not part of Sue's life. I mean, we've been every part of her life. So Esperanza, they gave me her number, and she's one, I love my sweet sister, but she'll call me back a few days, after she gets the call. That's kind of her personality. She'll be like, she'll get back to me. And I'm the same with her sometimes, God forgive me. But so what happened was she was cleaning her purse out. It was a Sunday afternoon before church, and she was cleaning out her purse. She was there with her brother-in-law, which was a retired Army officer. He had his gun with him. So when she heard my voice, and I just told her, I've made a mess, I need help. She goes, we will come. I think they drove a few hours to get me. And they came with the gun, and they just surrounded me in the store. Thank God my ex-husband was not there when they arrived. But God allowed me to get out of that place. Let me just find my place. Too far ahead. Excuse me. Yes. So as they got me into the car and they began to drive me these hours, they began speaking in the Spirit over me. And all of a sudden, I realized it was all a lie. Immediately. I mean, I had no minutes away from this guy to ever even think straight. So I had that time, and the presence of God that filled that car, I'm telling you, that I was being rescued. And so my friend brought me to Texas, and I stayed there for a week just sleeping. And then my parents' pastor said, you better get her out of there because, Texas and the whole situation, she needs to get home. And then the Lord allowed me to come home, and then immediately we went to district court in Newburyport when I got off the airplane and to see my parents. My dad doesn't drive to Boston, but that day he was there. They had no clue what I had been through, the depth of it, of course. But we drove to the district court, went into Newburyport District Court, and in that place, God gave me favor. I'm telling you, God uses secular things, God uses natural things. I went into that courtroom, and the judge, I'm telling you, was anti any cops that have done anything in the past, so I was like, I had the right guy. And not that I love police officers, this was just one situation with this man that did these things. But, so when I get to the courthouse, I go in, and this man, this judge, is behind me, and there was someone there called the Crisis Center that said, we want to represent you. And I went into that courtroom, and I was able to be represented by these people. And what was so beautiful is that I was in a locked unit that I would have never got to if I didn't go through what I went through. Like, God uses everything. Don't look at everything like, oh, this is such a bad thing. God will use even the negative, the horrible, the really bad for his glory. And so literally sitting in that room, I felt like I was listening to all of these women married to the same man, using the same scriptures, using the same tactics to institutionalize you if you weren't submitting. Deep, deep stuff. But I was able to minister in that place, even though it wasn't like I was like speaking down to them because I had arrived. But I was able to love them and tell them, this isn't God. These are sick men that did this stuff to us. And God has a plan even for them and all of that. So I wanted to share a few testimonies out of this. Positive stuff. Are we doing good? Everyone good? Yeah. God is good. I share this in strength because God has healed me. Our story isn't to keep it and be like, oh my goodness, I'm ashamed, or no. Our story is to tell others so that they can be set free. So I had severe PTSD when I came back. 3 years I had severe PTSD, even while I was going to these groups, and Mom and Dad went through so much, God bless them, of things I was seeing in the house and all the stuff that I had been through. And after 3 years, I stood up in a service and I shared my story. I shared it before that, but that day I stood up and I said, you know what, I pray one day I see my ex-husband in heaven. And all PTSD left me. It's been 7 years, not an ounce. I can hear the most horrific things now, and nothing shakes me because I know that my God is able to do above and beyond what I can ask, think, or imagine, that he has freed me from PTSD. I meet women all the time, and now it's such opportunities. Do you know how many women share their domestic violence stories with me, not even knowing my story? Then when I share with them, they're like, why are you so happy? I go, because I have Jesus in my heart. Let me tell you what Jesus did. Because you know what? Our story is just a story. It's not who we are. Your story doesn't define you. What was done to you, what you brought yourself to, whatever it is, it doesn't define. Sorry, I'm getting more. Try to stay. Okay, so 2 stories really quick I want to share before Dr. Wootton comes back up. But one was that after 6 months, I had been part of a church and I was doing Bible studies in this church. Even between 40 to 44, no one knew that I had gone through this. And I stood up in the church and I shared my story. And there was a woman and her husband that had come, and they had never been in the church before. They were just driving by. They were Christians, and she felt like she was supposed to come. Well, do you know that she had been married to a Texas cop, this woman. 17 years prior, she had gone through verbatim. I shared things about blinds I won't get into today, but things that I didn't even know that was maybe a Texas abuse situation. I didn't have a clue. I shared things that day. She wept like a baby. She came up to me after the service. She said, I have never shared my story with one person in 17 years. And my son that I was carrying does not know anything about his father. He thinks the man sitting next to us is his dad. And she wept and I held her and I said, 17 years from now, you will have the same stuff going on if you don't start talking about it. We can't push it down. We got to talk about it. It's hard, it hurts, but we got to get it out to get it, we got to get it up to get it out and to move on. But I'm telling you, when we start seeing the demonic stuff that's happened in our life and the darkness, it's scary and we just want to hold back. No, go with it. Go with it. It's part of what God's doing. It's part of what God's doing. So one more story is that a few years after I came to North Point, I went out on the street with a team and there was a woman on a bench and the Lord said to me, tell her your story. So I went over in the park in Haverhill and kneeled in front of her and I began to tell her my story, not knowing anything about her. She said 28 years domestic violence. And I said, you know what? There's freedom in God. There is freedom in God. And as I began to minister to her, and I prayed with her, and as I was praying, she goes, no more, I can't handle anymore. And I told her the same thing. 28 years from now, it'll be the same garbage you're dealing with. Because we've got to get it out to move on. We're not victims, but God wants to use our story. And if we've got a story to tell, and we're not telling it, we're missing out, and so is everyone else. So I close with, what is your story that God's asking you to share today? Dr. Wootton.
Thank you so much.
So now, how many of you are anxious to take something out of God's hands?
Wow.
Oh, but he can redeem it. He can. But how much better not to have taken that out of God's hands in the first place. Whatever it is that you've taken out of God's hands and you've messed up, God can redeem that. Things that you're tempted at this point to take out of his hands, please also learn the lesson to just leave it alone. Leave it in God's hands. If he's promised it, he can do it. Let's go back to Sarah. Though menopause had come, there was still at least one egg left, and it was Isaac's. And when the time came, God allowed that egg to drop and allowed it to be conceived, and his promise came through. She had to walk through a lot of heartache, and there are people today who are suffering from the consequences, but God is also redeeming those of the decision that Sarah and Abraham made in their life.
Yes.
But whatever God has promised you, he can do it. If he has promised you, I'll take the if off. Since he has promised you that as Jehovah Jireh, you will be the lender and not the borrower, he can do that. Since he has promised you that by his stripes you are healed, he can do that. Since he has promised you that he is preparing a place for you in heaven, that where he is, you may be also, he can do that. It takes faith. It takes faith. But I hope these testimonies have helped you to see it is better to trust in God and leave it in his hands than try to help God out. If he invites you to help him out, go for it. If he's not inviting you, leave it in his hands. How many of you think Sue's redemption story has had the final chapter written in it already? Not yet. There's more redeeming to do. As much as he has done in her heart and in the sharing of the testimony, those little 7 and 9-year-old kids will never forget her. And her testimony will still live on. Her prayers for that man have not been finalized yet. Her impact of her testimony has not been completed yet. God is a redeeming God, and he can do it in your life. Will you stand with me?